"I've found evidence for the Easter Bunny." A child who will remain nameless said this as they held an empty packet of Cadbury's mini eggs in their hand. Right now, all over the world, Christians are celebrating the belief that Jesus lived and died and rose again. But did it happen? Secular scholars have largely given up trying to back down the historical evidence and have swung back to simply asserting that dead men don't rise. We know that. We agree. Dead people don't normally come back to life. But that's beside the point. The question is, did Jesus of Nazareth die and rise again? Which way does the historical evidence point? Let's examine the evidence. Sometimes it's claimed that Jesus never existed at all. However, as agnostic atheist scholar Bart Ehrman has stated, the view that Jesus existed is held by virtually every expert on the planet. Now, that isn't evidence on its own, but the many reasons that they do believe that he did exist are staggering. The historical fact of Jesus' death is good reason to believe that he lived, that he existed. The many references to him in ancient sources, Pliny, Josephus, Suetonius, Tacitus, Lucian, the 4 eyewitness accounts of his life. Much more evidence than for, say, Pontius Pilate or Alexander the Great, and no one doubts that they lived. Sometimes it's claimed that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. Then he was perhaps revived by the cold tomb. No, Jesus was definitely dead. The brutality of Jesus' treatment before the cross, the expert Roman execution, they knew what they were doing. And the medical evidence backed up by modern science showed that he really was dead. The vicious scourging prior to his crucifixion was enough to kill someone. He was really real, and he was definitely dead. But here's the key. Jesus left behind an empty tomb. His body wasn't stolen, as some claim, because it couldn't have been. His body was placed in a marked, sealed, and double-guarded tomb. And even if the disciples had been able to steal the body, and Jews didn't mess around with dead bodies. They didn't do that. But even if they'd been able to steal the body, a battered, broken, dead body wouldn't convince anyone of a resurrection. It could never have been the start of what was the explosive Jesus movement of the first century. It doesn't make sense. Why would the frightened and frail disciples make all of this up? Going willingly to their deaths for something that they knew was a lie which they themselves had made up. That doesn't make sense either. Now, the most plausible historical explanation for the empty tomb is that Jesus was alive. But that's not all, because there were hundreds of eyewitnesses who met the risen Jesus. Sometimes 1 or 2 or a small group, indoors, outdoors, daytime, evening, different places. At least once the risen Jesus met more than 500 people in one sitting. There's no such thing as mass hallucination. It doesn't happen. And they weren't easily led. They weren't stupid, and they weren't gullible. In fact, many of the early followers of the risen Jesus were hard-nosed skeptics, bright, intelligent women who were the first on the scene, hard men like Thomas and Jesus' brother James, who was totally unconvinced until he met the risen Jesus. The Apostle Paul was the Dawkins of his day. Worse, his job was to go around and catch and arrest Christians. But something changed him. Now, the most radical skeptical atheist scholars agree with us on this. These people, these characters, these historical figures were immediately and dramatically changed. These ancient people weren't stupid, but they were convinced by evidence and experience. They'd seen and heard. If we're not to engage in what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery, we have to take them and their eyewitness testimony seriously. The reality is that sensible, educated, rational, reasonable people throughout history have been convinced by the evidence. As the Yale-trained investigative journalist Lee Strobel put it, he was ambushed by the evidence. Catherine found herself teaching youngsters about Jesus and his resurrection, but was it true? At 18 years old, she read everything she could get her hands on. She badgered a historian in Australia. She chased up all of the loose ends, and she became convinced, intellectually satisfied, that Jesus really did rise again. A year later, I met her, and sometime later, I married her. But what about you? Do you believe that Jesus lived? Do you believe that he died for your sins on the cross? Do you believe that he physically rose again? Because if you do, if you truly turn from sin and trust in him for forgiveness, he promises to take you on the journey that he's already travelled, from death to life, life forever, life with him.